When we think of great composers and our wish to emulate them either through practicing their music or composing our own works, I feel other important aspects of these composers is oftentimes ignored. Now, it might sound beside the point, but being a great composer is oftentimes more than just mastering music. And a smart and humble composer will never truly feel as if they've mastered their craft, as most of the time each work they compose will look to improve upon their previous work. This often leads to some of the best works of a composer being written in the final years of their life. However, it's hard to ignore that composers often did other things with their time than just compose and study music theory. I find it ever more disturbing how little the standard music curriculum focuses on things outside of music. I find this detrimental as it isolates composers from the real world. I've all too often met composers or musicians alike who just don't have much to talk about outside of music. Oftentimes the discussion, if about anything else, ends up on politics. But to be honest, since most of us live in a democracy of some sort or another, everybody has an opinion on politics, and honestly, if you ask me, there is too much focus on politics in art universities. Politics is such a current thing. The politics of now will be passé within a decade or two, so it's kind of frivolous focusing so heavily on it when art can be about so much more, and a good work of art should transcend the time in which it was written, no matter how much it's anchored in the political climate in which it was written. I made an argument about this very topic in my video about Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, so check it out if you haven't seen it yet. But I digress. Obviously politics plays an important part of composers' lives. But at some point it becomes tedious and ought not be what defines an artist of the past or current era. I don't blame these composers or musicians really, as conservatories often bury their students in a highly music-specific workload. I feel this over-obsessive perfectionist nature that is so pervasive in classical music never really allows students and professionals alike to develop other outlooks or passions. To turn a well-known phrase somewhat on its head, I'd say there is no harm in being a jack of many trades and a master of one. You can be a master of music, but you should also be proficient or knowledgeable in other realms. A great composer is better off knowing more of the world as opposed to just knowing every single theory book known to man. This became crystal clear to me when I was talking many years back to another composer. The discussion veered heavily into philosophy, a subject which has never been one of my favorite topics of discourse, as questions or postulations without concrete answers eventually become tiresome for me. But when I displayed disinterest in the topic, this older and wiser composer said something important to me, which was, if you know everything about music, you still know nothing. He was applying this, of course, to musicians or composers being knowledgeable of other things outside of music. It's more or less well known that many masterful composers were well read in the realms of literature, philosophy, poetry, or the arts in general. And we can look at specific examples such as Bach, who was an expert in rhetoric. Bach in turn used the rhetorical figures essential in developing a good orator in his music. And understanding Bach's music goes far beyond just understanding counterpoint. There's a wealth of rhetorical figures present in Bach's music, and it's a topic often ignored when people explain his music. But besides composers being experts in other areas besides composition, we have to consider that composers did other things with their time than slaving away fulfilling every whim their publishers demanded of them. Let's take Beethoven, a man who spent his afternoons and evenings taking long walks through the Vienna woods. This is an aspect of Beethoven that is often overlooked when people try to fathom his genius, and I'd suggest these hikes were just as valuable as the teachers he had when it came to what made him a great composer, as it gave his mind a break from the sterile and controlled environment of his apartment. Some in our current day and age might postulate doing such a thing daily to be a waste of valuable time. Just imagine if instead of walking around all afternoon, Beethoven had stayed at home composing. Just think how his output might have increased. Maybe we'd have 20 symphonies instead of 9. Well, maybe his output would have improved, but I'd contend that his creative output would have been severely impacted. These meditative breaks are what make those 9 symphonies all the more profound in their beauty. It's about quality, not quantity. Mozart, on the other hand, was an avid billiard player and at one point even owned his own table. As with Einstein, who took breaks from figuring out physics conundrums by playing the violin, so did Mozart take breaks from composing by playing on his billiard table. From accounts, he was supposedly very good at billiards too. I'd like to think this also played a role, however small it may seem, in the music he wrote. To be good at billiards comes down to more than just a simple pastime or hobby. It's a great way to exercise the gray matter of your brain as it demands good hand-eye coordination and spatial understanding. And I'd like to think that when Mozart got back to composing after a good billiard session, he had a fresh perspective on what he was writing. At least that's what I'd like to believe. We can continue with a composer like Mendelssohn, who was actually a talented painter who would do intricate watercolors whilst traveling Europe. And he wasn't alone, as other composers such as Gershwin or Schoenberg were painters themselves. This goes further to many composers having hobbies outside of music, such as Rossini, who was an accomplished cook who threw lavish dinner parties whilst in retirement, or Rachmaninoff, who loved gardening and landscaping, and John Williams, who is apparently an enthusiastic golfer. And in my case, I actually do other things besides compose and make YouTube videos. For example, outside of composing, I really love hiking. I find a good hike can give my brain a break, and oftentimes I will notice my creative output is improved when I return to composing. I also really enjoy painting with watercolors or oil on occasion, and it's a hobby that's followed me throughout my life. I'm only mentioning this because, from my own experience, these things I do outside of composing are what make me who I am, and that in turn becomes part of how I write music. I'm not saying these are the secrets to becoming a good composer, but just that through my experience, I found my hobbies outside of composing to be just as valuable as composing itself. Basically, what I'm trying to convey is that composers shouldn't just sit at their tables nerding around with theory and studying the masterpieces of others their entire life. This is important, of course, don't get me wrong, but still, it's important to consider that many composers often did other things with their time. I've met more and more living composers that seem to live in a detached artistic vacuum, and in turn, I've noticed it become harder to understand what the music they write is trying to convey. The emotions seemed forced or absent, the musical meaning of the piece artificial, the rhetoric of the music dead and detached, and I often assume that this has a lot to do with the narrow worldview of the composers themselves. No doubt they are often unbelievably talented or top of their class, but they lack other perspectives. They just don't seem to do much outside of music. They are immersed in the notes that make up the piece, but not well versed in the art that makes it music. I'm mentioning all of this because lately there is a lot of social pressure dictating musicians and composers to write and practice more than ever before, because we're all locked inside due to the pandemic, and now is the time to be extra productive. Look, I'm going to be very honest, I find this very annoying, because it's not like we're going to be having concerts or our pieces premiered anytime soon. So I'd suggest taking a break of sorts from music. And if you feel so inclined, why not use this time to find out what other passions you have and foster those, and in turn become a more complete person. And maybe you'll become a better musician or composer as a result.